The gymnasium fell silent, except for the sound of squeaking sneakers on polished wood and the heavy breathing of 14-year-old Ava Martinez, as Karen Hoffman's hands closed around her throat. The security guard's fingers pressed against the girl's windpipe while 23 classmates watched in frozen horror, their dodgeballs rolling forgotten across the floor. Karen's face was flushed red with rage, her voice a harsh whisper that somehow carried across the entire space. "You think you can cheat at dodgeball? You little fatty! Think you can fake being tired and get away with it?" The words came out like venom, each syllable punctuated by increased pressure on Ava's neck. The girl's hands clawed weakly at Karen's wrists, her brown eyes wide with terror and confusion. She had only been trying to catch her breath after running from one side of the gym to the other, dodging the relentless barrage of rubber balls that her classmates hurled with the enthusiasm that only came from knowing they had an easy target. 3 hours earlier, Ava had walked through the front doors of Lincoln Middle School with the same knot of dread in her stomach that had been her constant companion for the past 2 years. At 5 feet, 2 inches, and 170 pounds. She stood out among her peers not just for her size, but for the way she carried herself, shoulders hunched forward, as if she could somehow make herself smaller, invisible. Her dark hair hung in her face like a curtain, and she kept her eyes focused on the scuffed linoleum tiles as she navigated the crowded hallways. The morning had started like any other. Ava's father, Sheriff David Martinez of Clearwater County, had dropped her off at school with his usual kiss on the forehead and reminder to be strong, mija. Remember who you are. But strength felt like a foreign concept when you were facing another day of whispered comments about your weight. Another gym class where you would inevitably be picked last. Another lunch period spent eating alone while trying to ignore the stares and snickers from nearby tables. David Martinez had built his reputation on fairness and justice. At 42, he was the youngest sheriff ever elected in Clearwater County, having won over voters with his community-first approach and zero-tolerance policy for bullying and abuse. His officers respected him, his community trusted him, and his daughter was the center of his world. What he didn't know was that his daughter was suffering daily humiliation just 20 minutes from his office, in a school that was supposed to be a safe haven for learning and growth. Ava had always struggled with her weight. It wasn't for lack of trying. She had been on every diet her mother could find, had joined swimming classes and dance classes and martial arts classes, all of which had ended in tears and frustration when the other children's whispers became too loud to ignore. Her parents had eventually stopped pushing her toward activities, focusing instead on building her self-esteem and academic confidence. Ava excelled in mathematics and science, could write poetry that made her English teacher cry, and had a gentle spirit that drew wounded animals and lost causes to her like a magnet. But none of that mattered when it came to gym class, the 50-minute period that felt like a lifetime of humiliation. Coach Peterson meant well, but he was overwhelmed with 30 kids and limited resources. He relied heavily on the school's security staff to help monitor the gymnasium, especially during the more chaotic activities like dodgeball, flag football, and relay races. That's where Karen Hoffman came in. Karen had been working security at Lincoln Middle School for 8 months, hired during a budget crisis when the district couldn't afford to expand the teaching staff, but needed additional supervision for the growing student population. At 55, she was a bitter woman who had never had children of her own, and seemed to view her position as an opportunity to exert the authority she felt life had denied her. She had strong opinions about soft parenting and participation trophy culture, and she believed that children needed to be tougher, more disciplined, more willing to push through discomfort and pain. From the moment Karen first noticed Ava struggling during fitness activities, she had marked the girl as lazy, weak, and deserving of correction. She began making comments during gym class, loud enough for other students to hear. "Come on, Martinez, Stop dragging your feet. You're holding everyone back. Maybe if you spent less time at the cafeteria and more time moving your body, you wouldn't be so out of shape. I don't want to hear any excuses about being tired. When I was your age, we didn't get to quit just because things got hard. The other students had initially been uncomfortable with Karen's harsh treatment of Ava, but as weeks turned into months, they began to accept it as normal. Some even began to echo Karen's criticisms, sensing that the adult approval they could gain by joining in on the mockery was worth more than standing up for their classmate. The mob mentality of middle school took hold, and Ava found herself more isolated than ever. On this particular Tuesday in October, the gym class was playing dodgeball, a game that Ava dreaded more than any other. The rules were simple: 2 teams. Throw balls at each other. Get hit, and you're out. But for Ava, dodgeball was a nightmare of fast-moving projectiles and nowhere to hide. She was always among the first eliminated, not because she couldn't dodge the balls, but because she was the largest target and the easiest mark for students who wanted to score quick points. The game had been going for about 10 minutes when Ava made it to the far end of the gym, having successfully avoided several throws through a combination of quick thinking and sheer luck. But the constant running and dodging had left her winded, and she pressed her back against the wall, trying to catch her breath and prepare for the next volley of attacks. Her heart was pounding. Sweat was beading on her forehead, and her legs felt shaky from the adrenaline and exertion. That's when Karen noticed her. Martinez. The security guard's voice cut through the gymnasium like a whip crack. What do you think you're doing over there? This isn't nap time. Karen strode across the court, her heavy boots creating an ominous rhythm on the wooden floor. The game came to a gradual halt as students stopped throwing balls and turned to watch the confrontation unfold. Ava looked up with confusion and growing panic. I'm just catching my breath. Mrs. Hoffman, I've been running. Don't give me that garbage, Karen interrupted, now standing directly in front of the girl. You're hiding over here because you're too lazy to participate properly. You're cheating, plain and simple, while everyone else is playing the game. You're looking for ways to avoid doing the work. The accusation was so unfair, so completely divorced from reality, that Ava felt tears spring to her eyes. She had been trying harder in this game than she had in months, had actually managed to stay in longer than usual, and now she was being accused of cheating simply for taking a moment to breathe. I wasn't cheating, Mrs. Hoffman. I was just... Shut up, Karen snapped. I'm tired of your excuses. I'm tired of watching you drag down this entire class with your pathetic attitude. You want to act like you can't keep up fine. Let's see how you handle some real motivation. What happened next would be burned into the memory of every student in that gymnasium for the rest of their lives. Karen grabbed Ava by the arm and yanked her away from the wall, causing the girl to stumble and nearly fall. You're going to run laps around this gym until I tell you to stop, Karen announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. No breaks, no excuses, no stopping to feel sorry for yourself. Ava tried to protest, tried to explain that she hadn't been making excuses. But Karen wasn't interested in hearing anything she had to say. Start running. Now. The command was delivered with such authority that Ava immediately began jogging around the perimeter of the gym. Even though every instinct was telling her that this was wrong, that this was unfair, that she didn't deserve this treatment. As Ava ran her forced laps, Karen continued her verbal assault. This is what happens when you try to take the easy way out. This is what happens when you think the rules don't apply to you. She followed alongside Ava, close enough that her harsh words were clearly audible to the girl, but loud enough that the entire class could hear. Maybe if your parents had taught you some discipline, instead of letting you eat whatever you wanted whenever you wanted, we wouldn't be having this problem. The mention of her parents hit Ava like a physical blow. Her mother worked 2 jobs to help support their family. Her father dedicated his life to protecting their community. They were good people who loved her unconditionally and had never made her feel ashamed of her body or her struggles. For this woman to attack them, to suggest they had failed as parents, was more painful than any of the physical humiliation she was enduring. By the time Ava had completed her 3rd lap, she was struggling to breathe properly. Her face was flushed red, sweat was pouring down her face and back, and she was beginning to feel dizzy. She slowed to a walk, hoping Karen would show some mercy. But the security guard was relentless. "Did I tell you to walk?" Karen demanded, grabbing Ava's shoulder and giving her a rough shake. "You don't get to decide when you're done. I decide when you're done. Keep running." Ava tried to explain that she was having trouble breathing, that she needed just a moment to recover. But Karen interpreted this as more excuses and more defiance. "You know what your problem is," she said, her voice rising to a level that was almost shouting. "Your problem is that nobody has ever made you face consequences for your choices. Nobody has ever made you push through discomfort and discover what you're actually capable of." The gymnasium had become completely silent, except for Karen's voice and Ava's labored breathing. Even Coach Peterson, who had been sorting equipment in the storage room, emerged to see what was happening. But Karen was so focused on her tirade that she didn't notice the growing audience of concerned faces watching her every move. "You think you can fake being tired and get sympathy from everyone around you," Karen continued, now standing directly in front of Ava and forcing the girl to stop her lap. "You think you can manipulate situations to avoid doing what everyone else has to do. Well, let me tell you something. Little girl, the real world doesn't care about your feelings. The real world doesn't give you a participation trophy for showing up and half-heartedly going through the motions." Ava was crying now, tears streaming down her flushed face as she struggled to catch her breath. The combination of physical exhaustion and emotional trauma was overwhelming, and she felt like she might collapse at any moment. But Karen wasn't finished with her humiliation. "Look at you," Karen said with disgust, "crying like a baby because someone finally told you the truth about yourself. This is exactly what I'm talking about. This is the attitude that's going to make you a failure in life if somebody doesn't correct it right now." That's when Karen made the decision that would destroy her career, her reputation, and her freedom. She decided that words weren't enough, that this child needed to understand the consequences of what she perceived as disrespect and laziness. She grabbed Ava by the shoulders and gave her a hard shove, causing the already unsteady girl to fall backward onto the gymnasium floor. The sound of Ava hitting the ground echoed through the gym like a gunshot. Several students gasped audibly, and Coach Peterson started moving in their direction, finally recognizing that the situation had escalated beyond acceptable limits. But Karen wasn't done. As Ava lay on the floor, stunned and trying to process what had just happened, Karen stood over her with clenched fists. "Get up," she commanded. "Get up right now and stop acting like you're hurt. You're not hurt. You're embarrassed, and you should be embarrassed." When Ava didn't immediately comply, she was still trying to catch her breath and process the shock of being physically attacked by an adult. Karen reached down and grabbed her by the front of her gym shirt, hauling her to her feet with more force than was necessary. Ava stumbled, her legs still shaky from exhaustion, and now trembling with fear. "Please, Mrs. Hoffman," Ava managed to whisper, her voice barely audible. "I wasn't trying to cheat. I was just tired. I'm sorry if I—" "Don't apologize to me," Karen snarled. "Apologize to your classmates for wasting their time. Apologize to Coach Peterson for disrupting his class. Apologize to your parents for being such a disappointment." And that's when something inside Karen Hoffman snapped completely. Maybe it was the way Ava flinched at the mention of disappointing her parents. Maybe it was the girl's continued tears, despite Karen's commands to stop crying. Maybe it was the growing awareness that she was being watched by dozens of students and needed to assert her authority decisively. Whatever the reason, Karen made a choice that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She put her hands around Ava's throat. The action was swift and shocking. One moment Karen was standing in front of Ava, berating her for various perceived failures, and the next moment, her fingers were wrapped around the girl's neck, applying pressure that was immediately terrifying and dangerous. Ava's eyes went wide with shock and fear, her hands instinctively flying up to try to pry Karen's fingers away from her windpipe. "Maybe this will help you understand how serious I am," Karen hissed, her face inches from Ava's. "Maybe this will help you remember that actions have consequences. And, when you disrespect authority, you get exactly what you deserve." The gymnasium erupted in chaos. Students began screaming, some running toward the exit, others frozen in place by the horror of what they were witnessing. Coach Peterson was shouting Karen's name and rushing across the court, but he was too far away to intervene immediately. Ava was making choking sounds, her face beginning to change color as Karen's grip tightened. What none of them knew was that 23 miles away, in the Clearwater County Sheriff's Department, David Martinez was watching the entire scene unfold on his computer screen. The school district had installed a new security camera system 6 months earlier, complete with live feeds that could be accessed by law enforcement in case of emergencies. David had been reviewing some paperwork when his deputy, Maria Santos, had called his attention to one of the monitors. "Sheriff, you need to see this," Maria had said, her voice tight with concern. "Isn't that Ava's school?" David had looked up at the screen just in time to see Karen grab his daughter and shove her to the ground. His blood had run cold as he watched the woman stand over Ava, screaming at her while she lay on the gymnasium floor. But when Karen put her hands around his daughter's throat, David Martinez transformed from concerned father to law enforcement officer in the span of a heartbeat. "Call the school," he barked to Maria while simultaneously grabbing his keys and his weapon. "Tell them I'm en route and that they need to secure that gymnasium immediately. Nobody leaves that room until I get there." "Should I call for backup?" Maria asked, already reaching for her radio. "Yes. And call an ambulance. I don't know if she's hurt." David was already heading for the door, his mind racing with a mixture of parental panic and professional training. He had seen a lot of disturbing things in his 15 years in law enforcement, but nothing had prepared him for watching his own child being attacked by an adult who was supposed to be protecting her. The drive from the sheriff's department to Lincoln Middle School normally took 23 minutes. David made it in 12. His patrol car's sirens wailing as he weaved through traffic with the focused intensity of a man on a mission. Every second felt like an eternity as he thought about what he had witnessed on that security feed, about his daughter's terrified face, about the woman's hands around her throat. Back in the gymnasium, Coach Peterson had finally reached Karen and Ava, and he was shouting at the security guard to let go of the child immediately. "Karen, stop. What are you doing? Let her go right now." His voice carried the authority of someone who had spent 20 years managing teenage athletes. But Karen seemed to be in her own world, completely focused on the child in her grasp. It took the combined efforts of Coach Peterson and 2 eighth-grade boys, who were large enough to be physically intimidating, to finally force Karen to release her grip on Ava's throat. The girl collapsed immediately, gasping and coughing, her hands flying to her neck as she tried to breathe normally again. There were already visible marks where Karen's fingers had pressed against her skin. "Everybody back up," Coach Peterson commanded, creating a protective barrier between Ava and Karen. "Give her some space to breathe." He knelt beside Ava, his voice gentle despite the chaos surrounding them. "It's okay, sweetheart. Just focus on breathing. You're going to be okay." Karen stood nearby, her chest heaving with exertion and emotion, seemingly unaware of the magnitude of what she had just done. She needed to learn, she muttered, more to herself than to anyone else. Somebody needed to teach her that there are consequences. The sound of sirens could be heard approaching the school, growing louder and more urgent with each passing second. Within moments, the gymnasium doors burst open and Sheriff David Martinez entered like a force of nature, his uniform crisp and his badge gleaming, his hand resting on his service weapon as he surveyed the scene before him. His eyes immediately found Ava, who was still sitting on the floor beside Coach Peterson, one hand pressed to her throat, while tears continued to stream down her face. The sight of his daughter in distress triggered every protective instinct he possessed. But his years of training kept him focused and professional, even as his heart was breaking. "Ava, are you okay?" he called out, his voice carrying both authority and tenderness. "Can you breathe properly?" Ava looked up at the sound of her father's voice, and the relief that flooded her face was visible to everyone in the gymnasium. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice hoarse from Karen's assault. "She hurt me." David's jaw tightened as he turned his attention to Karen, who was standing about 10 feet away with a defiant expression on her face. Even now, even with a sheriff in full uniform staring her down, she seemed to believe that she had been justified in her actions. "Ma'am, I need you to step away from the children and place your hands where I can see them," David said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had made him one of the most respected law enforcement officers in the county. "You are under arrest for assault on a minor." Karen's eyes widened as she realized who was speaking to her. "Under arrest? Are you insane? I was disciplining a student who was being disrespectful and disrupting the class. That's my job. I have the authority to—" "You have the authority to supervise children, not to assault them," David interrupted, his voice growing harder. "You put your hands around my daughter's throat in front of dozens of witnesses. That's not discipline. That's a felony." The word daughter hung in the air like a thunderclap. Several students gasped audibly as they realized the connection between the sheriff and their classmate. Karen's face went pale as the implications of her actions began to sink in. She had just physically assaulted the daughter of the county's top law enforcement officer, in a room full of witnesses, while being recorded on security cameras. I didn't know," Karen stammered, taking a step backward as if she could somehow distance herself from the situation. "It wouldn't matter if she was the daughter of a janitor or the governor," David replied coldly. "What you did was criminal assault, and you're going to face the full consequences of your actions." By this time, backup officers and paramedics had arrived on the scene. The EMTs immediately went to Ava, gently examining her throat and checking her vital signs while David continued to handle Karen's arrest. The other students were moved to a separate area of the gymnasium, where they could be interviewed by officers and counselors about what they had witnessed. As Karen was being handcuffed and read her rights, she made one final attempt to justify her behavior. "That girl is lazy and disrespectful. She was cheating during the game and making excuses to avoid participating. Somebody needed to teach her that actions have consequences." David looked at her with a mixture of disgust and pity. "The only person who's going to learn about consequences today is you," he said quietly. "And trust me, Mrs. Hoffman, those consequences are going to be severe." The news of Karen's arrest spread through Lincoln Middle School like wildfire. By the end of the day, every student, teacher, and staff member knew what had happened in the gymnasium. The story continued to grow as parents heard about the incident from their children, as local news outlets picked up the story, and as social media amplified the outrage of a community that couldn't believe an adult in a position of trust had so thoroughly betrayed that trust. Karen Hoffman was charged with felony assault on a minor, child endangerment, and abuse of authority. The security footage from the gymnasium provided irrefutable evidence of her actions, and the testimony of more than 20 student witnesses painted a clear picture of a pattern of abuse that had been escalating for months. Her employment with the school district was terminated immediately, and her hopes of ever working with children again were permanently destroyed. The trial, when it came 6 months later, was swift and decisive. Karen's defense attorney argued that she had been trying to motivate a lazy student and that her actions, while perhaps overly aggressive, were not intended to cause harm. But the evidence was overwhelming, and Karen's own statements to police and the media had demonstrated a complete lack of remorse or understanding of the severity of her actions. She was sentenced to 18 months in county jail, 3 years of probation, and mandatory anger management and sensitivity training. She was also ordered to pay for Ava's medical expenses and counseling, though the financial compensation could never truly address the trauma she had caused. For Ava, the healing process was long and complicated. The physical marks on her throat faded within a few weeks, but the emotional scars took much longer to heal. She worked with a counselor who specialized in trauma recovery and slowly began to rebuild her confidence and sense of safety. Her parents surrounded her with love and support, reminding her daily that she was valued and cherished exactly as she was. The incident also sparked important changes at Lincoln Middle School. The district implemented new training protocols for all staff members, established clear guidelines for appropriate student discipline, and created multiple reporting mechanisms for students who experienced inappropriate treatment from adults. Coach Peterson became a fierce advocate for creating inclusive physical education programs that focused on personal improvement rather than comparison to others. Perhaps most importantly, Ava's classmates rallied around her in the aftermath of the attack. Many of them realized that they had been complicit in Karen's abuse through their silence, and they made a conscious effort to create a more supportive and inclusive environment. The same students who had once whispered about Ava's weight began inviting her to sit with them at lunch, including her in group projects, and defending her against any remaining bullies. 6 months after the incident, Ava Martinez stood in front of the Lincoln Middle School gymnasium, looking at the space where she had once been humiliated and attacked. But this time, she wasn't alone and afraid. She was surrounded by friends who valued her for her kindness, her intelligence, and her resilience. She had learned that her worth wasn't determined by her ability to run fast or throw a ball, but by the content of her character and the love she brought to the world. Her father, Sheriff David Martinez, continued to serve his community with the same dedication and integrity that had defined his career. But the incident had taught him important lessons about the hidden struggles his daughter faced every day, and he became a vocal advocate for anti-bullying programs and child protection initiatives throughout the county. As for Karen Hoffman, she served her time in jail and completed her probation, but she never truly understood the harm she had caused. In interviews with local news outlets after her release, she continued to maintain that she had been unfairly targeted for trying to discipline a difficult child. Her lack of remorse and refusal to accept responsibility served as a cautionary tale about what happens when people in positions of authority abuse their power and lose sight of their fundamental duty to protect the vulnerable. The gymnasium at Lincoln Middle School eventually became a symbol of transformation and resilience. Where once it had been a place of fear and humiliation for students like Ava, it became a space where every child was encouraged to do their best, to celebrate their improvements, and to support their classmates. The lesson that emerged from that terrible day was clear: when good people stand up to bullies and abusers, justice prevails, and communities become stronger. And Ava Martinez, the girl who had once been choked by a woman who was supposed to protect her, grew up to become a teacher herself, dedicated to ensuring that no child would ever again face the kind of abuse she had survived. Because sometimes, the greatest victories come not from avoiding struggle, but from transforming that struggle into strength that can heal the world.